Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the GI Huddle. Today we'll be speaking about the UK gaming market with Harry Barnick, Senior Analyst at Third Bridge. Hi Harry, thanks for joining us today.
Hi Tim, how are you?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks. It's our pleasure to have you on. And we're going to talk about the UK gaming market today, which means we've got absolutely plenty to discuss. But before we get into the nitty gritty, I think it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about Third Bridge, first of all, and kind of your role when it comes to analysing gaming.
Sure. So Third Bridge is an investment research company, and essentially what we do is we work alongside buy-side analysts and consultancy firms, so primarily private equity firms and hedge fund managers. And what we do is we essentially help them with their research, and the way we help them with their research is we proactively generate potential investment ideas in-house, and then we reach out to a network of high-profile experts that we work with to host an interview on that investment idea. And then we invite these clients, so hedge funds, private equity firms, and consultancy firms, to dial into these discussions to hear about a potential investment opportunity. We also then produce a transcript and an audio of that interview, so of that call. And it's very wide ranging in terms of the topics. I specifically work in the European consumer discretionary team. And so essentially what that gives me is it gives me responsibility for the leisure sector in the UK, but also across Europe. And obviously gaming, sports betting falls into that sector. So my job, or a part of my job, is essentially focused on generating investment ideas in-house and then speaking with former C-suite executives from some of the really large operators in the UK, but also with industry consultants on these topics.
Sure, yeah. And so in the last kind of few months, couple of years, I'm sure gaming and gambling has been a big part of your work. And
Sure.
right now with the upcoming kind of review in the UK, it's a crucial time for the UK gambling market. You mentioned you work alongside kind of investors, kind of C-suite. What is the mood at the moment among investors when it comes to maybe anticipation of regulatory change?
Tim, I think probably the best way to describe the environment amongst our client base is cautious. And I think there's a number of factors at play here as to why we're seeing a cautious environment. So firstly, we've seen increased focus around regulation from the Gambling Commission. And I think what would be useful here is if we look backwards slightly, and then we can kind of project forwards and think about what this means for 2021 and beyond. So quite recently, so earlier this year, the Gambling Commission came out and announced a number of strict measures for online slots. And the overall aim of these measures is essentially to make play less intensive and obviously just safer by design. And so what we're seeing an introduction of limits on spin speeds faster than 2.5 seconds. And we're seeing from the GC a permanent ban on features that speed up play or celebrate losses as wins. There's a couple of other features that are being blocked. Autoplay is being blocked, obviously, to limit the number of players who don't realize that the game is ongoing, and as a result, they're losing money. And the final feature which is being limited is the feature that gives the illusion of control to the gambler when in reality, no control exists. This is a predetermined game of winning and losing. And so the Gambling Commission has come out and announced these initial regulations. And that's causing some concern because what this is indicative of is a broader trend around a review of legislation on online gambling. Why is slots being targeted first? This is very strongly because, or is being targeted very strongly because the Gambling Commission believes that they have the highest average losses per player online. And what this is then leading to actually at ministerial level is a review of the Gambling Act from 2005. And just to, I guess, give some context to that, the Gambling Act of 2005 is essentially the basis of all gambling, the basis of all regulation for gambling in the UK. And why is it being reviewed, and why is that leading to a cautious environment amongst our clients? Well, ministers argue that the landscape has changed considerably since 2005. And the main change, they argue, is essentially we've seen a massive rise in online gambling. And what they want to do now is they want to ensure that the 2005 Gambling Act is fit for a digital age. This is particularly important currently, obviously, due to COVID. We have seen an accelerated adoption of online gambling. And so, it's not surprising to see now that ministers are stepping in to sort of drive some further regulation in the sector. And I think what we're going to see here is a number of factors which I think will illustrate why investors are cautious. So on the one hand, we've mentioned speed limits. So the Gambling Commission has already come out and introduced speed limits for online slots. What ministers are saying is they'd like to take a further look at that. So whilst the 2.5, so 2.5 second limit is currently being implemented and needs to be implemented by operators by the 31st of October 2021, so later this year, this could actually be extended in terms of the time. So it could be extended to 3 to 5 seconds per spin. And so ministers basically want to limit the amount of times you can play in any given minute based on that spin speed. We're also seeing a heightened focus around VIP customer contact. And this follows on from some regulation we saw from the GC at the back end of last year around VIP treatment. But essentially what ministers want to ensure is that operators are moving away from regular contact with their VIPs. And on top of that, what they potentially would like to see is deposit limits introduced for VIP customers. And just to, I guess, quantify how big this could be for the sector, whilst VIPs only make up 1% of total gamblers, they drive up to 20% of sector revenues. And that's coming directly from the experts that we work with. I just mentioned maximum deposits there. This is also something that's being looked at, which is causing concern amongst our investor base. So what we could see is we could see maximum deposits introduced. And this isn't a complete cap on the amount you can deposit each month, but what it is essentially, it's a limit beyond which, when you want to deposit more than that, you essentially have to go through quite a rigorous affordability check and proof of funds. The numbers being thrown around at the moment are anywhere between £100 and £250 essentially for a deposit limit. And which way regulation goes at the moment is very hard to tell. The final very key part of the regulation, which I think is probably causing the most concern and leading to the particularly cautious environment, is the implementation of stake limits. So historically, we've seen stake limits introduced in the retail landscape via fixed odds betting terminals, otherwise known as FOBT. What we're now seeing is a potential introduction of stake limits online. And what we're hearing from our experts is it's very likely that online regulation will follow the retail regulation, and it will be in the form of a £2 stake limit. One final thing I should probably mention, Tim, is just around less advertising. Whilst it's relatively uncertain at the moment what that could actually mean practically for the sector, ministers are also looking into how operators advertise their services to potential customers. So essentially, these are the factors that are really leading to this cautious environment. The final one that's probably worth mentioning is also, potential taxation. So, COVID has led to a huge deficit as the government has supported businesses and customers through the crisis. In order to pay back that money, the gambling sector could be a very easy target. And so what we could see is a hike in taxes. Our experts indicate that taxes online for gross gaming revenue are currently around 21%. And some of them are forecasting that this could grow to above 25%, and that tax would be put through the budget. That didn't happen in the most recent budget, potentially a surprise, but it's also a cause for concern in the future.
Absolutely, thanks for a very thorough rundown there. And you talked about you've also written for us in our March-April Gambling Insider magazine. Sure. And in that article, because you just mentioned there's some changes that have already been implemented. In that article, you talked about the timeline for the actual Gambling Act review. Bearing in mind what you just said, could you maybe talk us through a timeline of when we could know exactly what the GC and the government kind of have in mind? But also, you mentioned kind of several measures there. Which ones are your investors kind of most cautious about? I guess you singled out really the stake limits as that kind of most, perhaps the biggest change.
Yeah, no, exactly, Tim. So firstly, in terms of the timelines, there's no fixed timeline at the moment, but the best estimate from our experts indicates that it could take anywhere between 9 and 18 months, essentially, before we see policy in place. And I think a common question is, why does it actually take this long? So let's unpick the process. Essentially, what we're seeing is the government will first ask for a call for evidence. So here they will be going out to the Gambling Commission, to individual gamblers, and they'll be collecting evidence on how they interact with certain betting products. They will then hear this evidence in order to analyze it appropriately. And this all takes time. And then from there, they will make policy recommendations, which then have to go through government, probably number 10, and the Treasury, to ensure that all interests are aligned and that everyone's on board. And then from there, a report will be published recommending secondary legislation and new regulations. And I think the feeling at the moment amongst the investor audience and also amongst operators is that this regulation is really being driven by emotions. And so, I think the fact that it's going to take slightly longer to really review the facts will be very welcome. And so, this process will take a relatively long time, anywhere between 9 and 18 months are the best estimates from our experts. In terms of, what is the most, I guess, or what measures I would single out as being particularly distressing, and, really it's stake limits. I've mentioned this already, but, this is definitely the part that worries investors the most. And the reason why it worries investors the most is because this is a huge revenue generator for operators in the sector. And so, let me just quantify that. So the relative amount of customers playing slots at more than £2 per spin is only around 10% of each session, but it represents about 50% of revenues for these games. And so any introduction of slot limits, of stake limits, above that amount would obviously be a huge hit to revenues. The silver lining is that it won't necessarily be applied to casino and bingo, and it's only for random number generator games, but it's still a huge chunk of revenue here that is at risk, essentially. And that's why, I think that particular measure is causing the most concern amongst our investor audience.
It might be difficult to look at this because it might be looking at kind of almost as though you're looking through a crystal ball. But in your view, what is the kind of the most stringent situation you can imagine for operators, given that you've mentioned kind of advertising could go down, stakes could go down? What is the kind of maybe, I don't want to say a worst case scenario, because perhaps people looking at responsible gambling might view it as a best case scenario. Sure. But as you say, for investors, what is perhaps the most the tightest restrictions that could all come in one package, I guess?
Yeah, I think that one's quite hard to predict. And because it's such an emotional issue, as I said, it can be very difficult to know exactly which way the government will go. Will they review the facts, or will they be driven by the media and by public sentiment and follow their emotions around regulation? And this is something that we saw actually in the previous regulation around FOBTs. The Gambling Commission actually suggested a £30 stake limit, but the government went ahead with a £2 stake limit. And I think investors and operators felt quite blindsided by that. They'll be more prepared now. And so I think what they'll be preparing for is most definitely a £2 stake limit online. So that's probably the most stringent stake limits are going to get. We've spoken about a 2.5 second spin limit. I think a stringent spin limit would most likely be 5 seconds. That's what we're hearing from our experts. And then if we think about deposits, so maximum deposits, some experts have indicated that it could be up to £250 based on discretionary income. There is the number of £100 being thrown around. And I think it's clear that £100 would be a lot more stringent. And just to put that into perspective, Bet365 at the moment is running a deal for new members where if you bet £100 or you deposit £100, you receive £100 back. So their base case here is they're trying to encourage people to deposit £100. If that was then suddenly to be the limit, I think a lot of operators and a lot of investors would see that as quite stringent. As I said, the experts we're speaking with indicate hopefully that it will be around the £250 mark based on discretionary income, but I think a much more stringent number would be £100.
Now you mentioned the Gambling Commission there, and we can't really discuss this situation without mentioning that obviously last week Neil MacArthur, the CEO, announced his resignation.
Sure.
But also as part of this Gambling Act review, You know, there's been talk of maybe creating a gambling ombudsman, the role of the GC itself. How do you think a review of the regulator could end up affecting this process and the industry?
I think so. So firstly, you know, it's very interesting timing. Obviously, the CEO leaving. What this really means for the 2005 Gambling Act review, I think, is unknown. And I think what's really more important is what does that actually mean for the future of the GC, and you know, why is the GC actually being investigated? I mentioned already that they promoted a £30 stake limit in prior regulation, so in the FOBT regulation that was implemented in retail shops. I think at least what we're hearing from our experts is that the view at government level is that the GC was quite slow to act. You know, the government was pushing £2, the media was pushing £2, and as a result, the public were in favour of £2. The GC continued to push a £30 stake limit. And so I think what we saw, or what we're hearing from experts that we saw, is essentially ministers believed that they were being slow to act, and as a result they are looking into the powers of the GC to ensure that that doesn't happen again. And you know, how this really plays out is going to be extremely difficult. Obviously, as you say, there has been some talk about a potential gambling ombudsman being set up to replace the GC. What we know is that the GC is going ahead with regulation, so acting as if it's going to continue to exist. And they're actually trying to implement some measures that may already be introduced in the 2005 Gambling Act. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to push ahead with regulation that they anticipate will be introduced, into the review. And obviously the reason why they're doing that is because this time around, they don't want to be blindsided by any potential stake limit, but they also want to ensure that they're showing that they're acting appropriately. And I think that will be key moving forward for the GC.
Given everything we're discussing, in a practical sense, how can operators and perhaps investors as well prepare now for anything that might come in once the review is announced, given, as you say, it's still difficult to see exactly what will be announced?
So, I mean, firstly, there has been some regulation implemented by the GC earlier this year. So, and that one was around the speed limits online. So the first thing operators need to be doing is they need to be preparing essentially for that regulation. The GC has set the date as the 31st of October 2021, whereby this needs to be implemented. So operators need to ensure that they're ready for that date. I think what they also need to be doing, and this is something actually that we're hearing from operators already, is they need to be moving away from the treatment of, or they need to be backing out of how they treat VIPs. And this is something that our experts are really clear on. The regulation around VIP treatment is going to be introduced. How stringent it will be, we don't yet know. But the best way for operators to prepare is to already step back from frequent conversations with VIP customers. And this is something that you're hearing in earnings calls from management across operators, is this is something that they are already implementing. So they are doing their best to prepare for any potential regulation around VIP treatment. And the final one, I think, included within that is affordability checks. So at the moment, we have guidance on affordability checks. There may be stricter guidance implemented, or in fact, regulation around affordability checks. So a really good way for operators to prepare is essentially to already start building out internal capabilities around affordability checks, and also ensuring that the current checks that are in place are sufficient so they don't see any backlash once regulations are implemented.
Well, we've touched on a lot of issues there, and there's clearly plenty going on. But a final question for you, Harry. And again, this is a broad one, so sorry to put you on the spot. But given, again, everything we're discussing in upcoming regulation, do you think this could really be a watershed moment and there could be major changes in UK gambling? Or do you think, there will be changes here and there, but operators will adapt and we may see kind of a status quo still being maintained?
It's a very interesting question, Tim. And I think there's probably two pieces to this. So one is, what are we going to see from the regulation? As I've explained today, it's quite clear that we are going to see a fairly large shift in regulation on the online market in particular. So the status quo will not be maintained from a regulation perspective online. We are going to see changes, and they will be material for operators and investors alike. But what does this really mean for the sector? And I think something we're hearing from experts, which is particularly interesting, is what this means for the competitive landscape. when we see new stricter regulations implemented, it's likely to benefit the larger operators. And so what we're hearing from our experts is that actually the biggest companies in the space, so the likes of Entain, William Hill, Bet365, these players will survive and potentially even thrive in this new regulatory landscape. They will be able to consolidate their positions, as will players like 888. What we will unfortunately see is maybe a drop off in the number of smaller competitors in the sector. And so I think, whilst regulation will change, we might, or what we will hopefully see regulation implemented, but we might see on the back of that, and what we're hearing from our experts is that we will potentially, that could potentially lead to a very monumental shift in the competitive landscape. And I think that's one of the things that will be most interesting to follow. And obviously, our clients and investors will be trying to understand who is best positioned to benefit from this increased regulation.
Yeah, as you say, the race is very much on. Harry, thanks very much for an in-depth assessment of everything, and thank you for your time and your analysis.
No problem, Tim. Much appreciated.
Thanks for watching our GI Huddle interview with Harry Barnick. For more from the analyst from Third Bridge, he's written a piece in the March-April edition of Gambling Insider magazine, which you can find on gamblinginsider.com.